My name's Bill, and I'm a recovering geek. I need to hand these to someone else, thought I tell. Keep them away from me for the evening. I started to live in my head, or have lived much of my life in my head, and started as a kind of young child. I grew up in a house in the woods, couldn't see another neighbor, was an only child, so grew up kind of hearing my parents' stories. My dad was like having a live-in grandfather. He was a freshman in college when the Wright brothers flew, and he used to tell me that when he heard Teddy Roosevelt speak, he was surprised with a high, squeaky voice he had. He used to love to tell stories of challenges and how he would try and suss them out. He was the strongest man in his class in college because he looked at how they scored it, and it turned out to be how much weight you lifted. And it didn't matter whether you did a deep knee bend to lift your body weight or did a pull-up. So he figured, I'll just do the deep knee bends. The heck with the pull-ups. He got to be the strongest man in college. The story that he loved to tell me was how a friend of his got thrown out of class just for coming in late. So you know what he did? He found his way to the basement, and a heating grate in the floor underneath the podium heard every word of the rest of the lecture. And that was the sort of stories that my dad used to like to tell. Those were kind of the fun ones. And then he also sometimes would tell of his work in business, which had seemed just about as improbable and just about as successful. He'd also once showed me his college transcript. How many of your dads ever did that to you? Yeah. Rate of work was 4 classes. He had 6 A's and an A+. And he thought that almost anything was possible if you put your mind to it. My mom, though, thought that things weren't quite so possible, that the world was a much more hazardous place. The only reason that she learned to drive was that so I wouldn't have to take the school bus, so that she would drive me. And I think just after she'd gotten her license, she was driving, my dad was in the car, and she made a left turn, but forgot to signal, and got pulled over by the cops. And she couldn't let go of that. Every time she'd see a cop after that, she'd be kind of fearful, say, what did I do wrong? Are they watching me? Though I was an only child, I didn't have many playmates within easy distance, and my parents never entertained and kind of very seldom went out. My dad was still working full-time when I was growing up. When he came home, what he loved to do is just chill out. He'd hang out with me, which was great. And on the weekends, up until he was about 70, what he liked to do was go through the woods and clear footpaths that we could walk along as a family. Kind of really solitary work, because that's how he would unwind. My mom didn't like to go out because she was afraid of making some sort of social mistake and having something unpleasant happen. So I started to live in my imagination rather than in the observation that I had seen of the world. And I had a vivid imagination, and I turned into a geek very quickly. I was the only one in my first grade class to wear glasses. So I have been wearing these for 67 years now. The frames looked even geekier when I was a kid. The one time that every year that we did go out together as a family, though, was to the annual book sale at my elementary school. They'd take the whole room of the library and another lobby, a space larger than this, and there would be tables and tables full of books, and I'd spend hours there. My dad had dozens of bookshelves at home, all filled. And so he would, I could just pick out whatever I wanted, and it would usually be a stack this much that I'd carry out. And my nose would be in a book much of the time as I was growing up. I did do some other sort of boy things, like put together lots of plastic model airplanes. And I discovered that glue sets really quickly. But there was an upside to that too. I found if you held two toothpicks together for just a few seconds, they'd stay in that position. And you could add a third toothpick, and a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, and an eighth, until I got a tower up about this high just made out of toothpicks. You can tell how much else I had to do with my time. So when I went on to high school, I was a math and science geek, and really kind of got into math and science, and then went to college and found the geekiest thing I could do the next summer, which was to work on an archaeological site as a volunteer digger. And in the course of that summer, one of the things I uncovered was a bison rib that gradually grew as I moved the dirt away till it was about this long. And there were scratches along the whole length of the rib. The next day, I found a piece of flint whose broken edge matched the scratches. And I realized this was the tool that someone had used to scrape their dinner off the bones. And I put kind of two and two together and got fascinated by that, and then fascinated by how did they do that? What environment did they see? How did that environment change with time? There was a geology course that I took, and that was fascinating too. And before I graduated, I was making pictures in my head of the way the world worked, how the different pieces kind of came together. And I found you could make a profession out of that. So I came to New Haven as a graduate student and spent first 8 years learning more and more about less and less until I knew everything about nothing. And if you want to hold a picture in your head of geekiness, imagine me in sort of a hazmat suit, long white coat, plastic gloves that came up to here, a face shield to prevent not something from contaminating me, but from me contaminating something else, and sitting on top of a 60-foot tower, tinkering some equipment. That's the easy part to visualize. Now the other part was, imagine that this 60-foot tower was sticking up from the loveliest beach you ever saw in Hawaii, and everyone else on that beach was in their swim trunks, lying back and having a beer. And I thought, I didn't think, what's wrong with this picture? I thought, what's right with this picture? This is kind of cool. And what I was collecting samples of was a natural radioactive isotope of lead, and there was as much of that in the whole atmosphere of the Earth as there was beef in one Big Mac. So I had really learned more and more about less and less. After being a professional geek for 25 years, there was a sudden windfall from a company that my dad had started, and that funded a charitable foundation that he had set up at a time when he was nearly broke. I was an only child, so it kind of fell to me to try to make something out of this legacy that he had created really as an expression of hope and possibility rather than achievement or certainty. So I had to learn how to spell philanthropist. I also had to work on learning how to spell extrovert as if I believed it. And the more I worked there, the more I realized I was kind of in over my head in lots of ways. There were lots of things. The fund was set up as a memorial to my uncle, and by extension, really, I took it as a memorial to my parents. And the more I thought about it, the more I had these two different views of the world that I grew up with and that were inside me. One of that everything was possible, and the other thing was that the world is hazardous and the stuff, what I really want, may be impossible. After a technical geek challenge here. There, got that sound okay? After a couple years of this, I happened to get a announcement of a retreat in the mail that I was supposed to pass on to my church community, the New Haven Quakers. And it was a retreat called Emerging Ministries, for people who are beginning to feel the inkling of a new direction, coming up from their heart, and are trying to sort out what to make of it, how to move forward into that thing. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, oh, that sounds like something maybe I'd like to go to. So I sent in my application. And the retreat was up near Greenfield, Massachusetts, starting on a Friday afternoon. And I thought, I've been living in my head for so long, driving up Interstate 91 in rush hour on a Friday is not the way to get set for the retreat. So I'd been bicycling a lot, and I thought, I'll make a 2-day bicycle trip out of it. So had a ceremonial start at Clark's Dairy and had 2 milkshakes for fuel, and headed up the Farmington Canal Trail with 10 pages of Xerox cutouts from maps to find the route that would be where I wouldn't get run over on the way. And that certainly kind of got me out of my head. And as it was the longest trip I had done, so part of it was, how long will this hill last? And part of it was, my goodness, this morning is beautiful. To riding along a stretch of Route 5 right along the Connecticut River that was 4 lanes but almost no traffic because I-91 had bypassed it, and having this wonderful, huge road with no car on it, the full lane for shoulder with the Connecticut River going by. When I got to the retreat, there was a housekeeping session that started us off, and then we broke into, there were maybe 30 of us all together. We broke into small groups that we'd return to during the weekend. And that first small group session, there was no agenda. There was a facilitator there, but she said, this time is yours. Silence among Quakers isn't quite as awkward as silence amongst other groups, but this still felt a bit awkward. One person said, I have an idea. Why don't we each kind of share the story of why we came to the retreat? And we all thought, yeah, great idea. And one of the things that I had really worried about in this retreat was I didn't know how much in common I'd have with people there. Like my story of a fellow finds himself in the 1% suddenly and has strange family trying to make sense of that wouldn't be something with a whole lot of resonance. I mean, by definition, 99% of the people there wouldn't identify. So the person who had the suggestion of sharing the stories started. And she got halfway into her story and had us all drawn in. And she said, let me pause it there. Let's go around in a circle and each take a turn starting our story. So the next person to her started their story, paused in the middle. The third person picked up on something that the first one had said And then the fourth person built on something that was emerging as a theme. And by the time we'd finished telling the first half of our story, we realized we all had the same story. We'd all been through something that was difficult, more challenging than we'd expected, hard to make sense of, wounding. And we'd done much of the work of working through it, of healing, and all had the sense that there may be something I have to offer others. But also being cautious, making sure, have I done my own work here enough that it really is worth passing on? I don't want to, I've heard a phrase later, you either transform the pain or you transfer it. That suddenly tuned my ears. And at the rest of the retreat, I listened to other people's participation. And about 27 out of the 30 of us all fit in that pattern. As I came back home, I realized, and I started to listen with the same ears to what I heard around New Haven. And I started asking people questions systematically. What's your hope for what you personally most want to accomplish? What gets in your way? And the answers to that were basically what started CLP. So this is really how, those of you who know CLP, how it got started. Now, being a geek and living in my head, it's sometimes hard to sink in that what I really need, what I'm really looking for, it's hard to see what's right in front of me. So I picked up some from this retreat, but I also got a cosmic warning, sort of a dope slap before I left, which said, pay attention. The Thursday that I was going to get on my bicycle, I was reading the New York Times over breakfast, and there was a photograph on the front page of the second section. About 50 Native Americans walking along the side of a road, rabbit brush, volcanic landscape. I could almost kind of smell the pinon coming off the newsprint. This was New Mexico. And as I read the story, it turned out that these people in the picture were retracing their ancestors' footsteps, retracing a 70-mile journey across the Rio Grande and up through Galisteo Creek and into the valley of the Pecos River. And the story really begins in this Pecos Valley about 1,000 years ago, when some Pueblo people from the Four Corners area migrated to this part of New Mexico and started raising a village out of the ground. They took the native stone and with mud and straw adobe mortar started to build their village. The land there was fertile. The Pecos River was one of the few really perennial streams, thank you, in New Mexico. There was enough water for irrigation and agriculture, and the village started to thrive and grew till it held about 2,000 people. There was a wall of stone and adobe that encircled the entire village. The houses were built into the wall, and it surrounded a large central plaza. In the Pueblo worldview, all of their ancestors came from the fourth world, which is down below the surface of the earth. And their sacred spaces were not built up above ground, but were circular rooms built below ground, where they could connect and remain grounded with their ancestors. The ceremonies that the men took part in would take place in these kivas, these underground chambers. that you could access only by a ladder coming in through an opening in the roof. This village thrived of Pecos for hundreds of years. And the life of the village centered on this plaza. And up from around this, you could see mountains rising up to 12,000 feet, and the valley drifting off below to where the fields were, great plains to the east where there was plentiful game for hunting. In the early 1500s, a creature unlike they'd ever seen before appeared one day. It had 2 heads, 6 legs, and the top of it shone brilliantly. It was a Spanish conquistador in armor riding horseback. The Spaniards had heard of the 7 cities of gold and asked, was this one of the cities of gold? Being a little bit disappointed at just the stone and mud. And whoever responded was very quick-witted. He said, no, that's further east, much further east. And that was the only contact for decades. Then the Spanish returned and set up camp next to the village of Pecos, tried to start trade with the Indians, or the native peoples. And the natives were divided as to whether we should have anything to do with the Spaniards or not. The Spanish gradually gained more and more control, traded, and then forced, really, the native peoples to share part of their crops with them, and to put away their native religion, and to adopt Christianity. This went on for decades, and it became clear to the people of Pecos and to the other pueblos that they could not survive much longer. And although they spoke different languages, the different Pueblo villages under the leadership of Popé, whose statue is now in one of the 2 of New Mexico in the National Statuary Hall in Washington, organized the first American Revolution, and on August 11th, 1680, revolted and drove the Spaniards completely out of what is now northern New Mexico. The Spaniards had built one of their churches right in one of the kivas, and when the Pueblo revolted, they desecrated the churches, tore them down, and reestablished the sacred kivas. In about 15 years, though, the Spaniards came back. And this time, their interest all along was economic. But when they came back, they reoccupied the area, but realized they couldn't be quite as harsh, or they would really kill their source of cash. But the Spaniards' presence, what they had taxed the village for, the diseases that they brought, had weakened the village. The Comanche on the Great Plains knew of this and raided the village. And the village that had held 2,000 people gradually dwindled till there were only about 18 people left. And they realized they could not sustain this anymore. The different pueblos spoke different languages, and there was only one other pueblo, Walatoa, that spoke the same Toa language as Pecos. And a delegation from Walatoa came to Pecos and held council with the last people living there, and offered them to come live with them at Walatoa. And so the last people of Pecos took what few possessions they could carry, with their heads still full of the stories and the traditions of their village, packed up their belongings, and with their distant cousin, walked the 70 miles to the village of Walatoa. During the Spanish reoccupation, the one thing that Spaniards had done was to build another church, this one much more massive than the first. It took 1 million adobe bricks to build, and an adobe brick is about 50 pounds. And they built it right over the central kiva of Wauwatoa. The adobe mortar washed out fairly quickly from the walls of Pecos, but the church was so massive that it faded away and still stands, but it eroded away very gradually. And by the time the 20th century had come around, there were just the walls of the church and low mounds where the walls of the village of Pecos had been. In the 1920s, an archaeologist from Massachusetts, named of Alfred Kidder, decided to excavate the remains of Pecos Pueblo. Remember archaeology? This is one place where this story caught my ear. And most archaeology up until then had just been sort of an academic form of grave robbing, just digging up what was there. But Kidder was one of the first scientific archaeologists. He kind of peeled the layers back in time, one at a time. And he saw how the pottery changed with time, how the evidence of culture had changed with time, how the civilization there had changed. And it was a key to understanding the chronology of human occupation in the Southwest. He also removed the remains of about 2,000 people who had been buried at Jemez. And I can imagine what that scene looked like, although where I was, we only found animal bones. I can still picture brushing away the dirt from the human bones, lifting out of the place where they had rested for hundreds of years, and scribbling with India ink a number to replace the name of the person. And those were moved back to the museum in Massachusetts, where the front door had Alfred Kidder's name on the top of the list of directors. And that collection of bones became a source of continuing scientific study of understanding the diet of people, what diseases they'd suffered from, and clues to how they had made a living. But Kidder never thought to ask the people of Pecos living at Wauwatoa what was under the ground there. They already knew. They not only knew what was under the surface, they knew who was under the surface. For when they had moved to Wauwatoa, in addition to being made full members of the village of Wauwatoa, they also were invited to form a separate group, the people of Pecos living at Wauwatoa. So they had their own tribe within a tribe to keep their memories alive, to keep their language, to keep their traditions, and to keep their tribal officers like the war chief who would oversee, to see that traditions were maintained. So they had the blessing of keeping their language and keeping their identity while still joining another village, another society. In the 1980s, Native peoples started to organize to recover those bones or sacred objects that had been removed to museums. One of them, Suzanne Harjo, went to meet with the director of the Smithsonian Museum and the director of the Field Museum in Chicago and made her case. She said, it's time for these bones to return home. The director of the Field Museum said to her, Ms. Harjo, it's hard to overstate how valuable these bones are to science. And she said, they're not just bones, they're human remains. What Suzanne Harjo didn't know was that the director's mother had died the week before, had passed to the other side. And she could not know that her words would change the way he saw what the cabinets in his museum held. And he had a change of mind and a change of heart, and testified before Congress and said that these bones, or these remains, which have just helped us grow a picture in our minds of what the ancient world looked like, it's time for them to return home. So in 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which required museums to return those bones and sacred objects to their ancestral home. The director of the museum, which now had several names above Alfred Kidder, so you could have excavated those names just as he'd excavated the site, youngest on top, oldest on the bottom, called up the archaeologist William Watley at Wallatoa. We have some materials that may be of interest to you. We know. Let's talk. And so a delegation of the people of Pecos living at Wallatoa went to meet the directors of the museum, curators of the museum, in the brick room on the second floor with the buzzing fluorescent lights and the cabinets of the bone that held the remains of their ancestors. Pete Toa, the war chief now of the people of Pecos, said when we walked in there, we all felt this great sadness coming out of the cabinets, and some of us shed a tear. But the anthropologists had learned a few things and began the meeting by inviting the people of Pecos to begin it with a prayer in their language. So the meeting began with a feeling of respect, and it soon became evident to everyone in the room that the bones were going home. Everyone in the room felt a sense of joy coming out of the cabinets, as Pete Toa said, as if the bones were telling us one thing, and one thing alone: we want to go home. So, on May 18th, 1999, a semi-trailer, a Thursday morning, pulled out of the loading dock of the museum with the remains of 2,000 people of Pecos. And they took 3 days to drive across the country to New Mexico. That same Thursday morning, all of the able-bodied descendants of the people of Pecos, now numbering about 500, retraced their ancestors' footsteps, going back to Pecos to welcome their ancestors' remains back home. That was the picture in the New York Times, and I was starting on my bicycle trip, and I thought, what a metaphor to be riding along on my bike as the remains of the people of Pecos are going home again. So I had them in mind frequently as I was riding. There's another picture now in the National Geographic, and it shows a white semi-trailer in the late, bright sunlight, driving along a narrow asphalt road, tall grass, scattered pinon and juniper, surrounded by 500 Native Americans, now in their ceremonial dress. And then they dismissed the photographers, and they dismissed the park rangers, and the people of Pecos living at Wallatoa could welcome their ancestors back home. And then they could turn and face a new day with with their story, with a story of healing. And not just that their ancestors were at home and at rest and at peace, where they could connect with their ancestors and know they were there. But no, it was partly through their labors in maintaining their tradition and their courage and their faith in the face of uncertainty that they had played such a role in this work of healing that was a gift not only to themselves, but I think to all who've heard that story. There's a little bit of a postscript here. When I saw that painting or picture in the Times, I had a souvenir T-shirt from Walatoa, which I thought, great, I'll wear that. And so that's what I wore when I bicycled up to the Emerging Ministries retreat, which, as you know, was a more profound experience than I was bargaining for. And I haven't worn it much since, because I began to feel like that was cultural appropriation. This wasn't my shirt to wear. But as I was kind of preparing for tonight, I realized, no, that was an article of commerce that was not taking anything that was sacred or ceremonial. And I realized it was preparing for tonight that this was my journey of remembering too, of retelling some of my parents' stories and struggles, and felt in a way honored and kind of blessed to be able to acknowledge the gift of the kind of people of Pecos in helping me to remember my own story by holding my bones as I was cycling along. So, and I have one other thing to show here. This is the, let's see, let me bring this out here. This is the church at Pecos today. And this story sort of followed me. I mean, American Airlines put me in the next seat to Suzanne Harjo. Go. And as I look at this story, at this picture now, I realize this is sitting on top of a kiva. This is kind of what oppression looks like, physically embodied. And this is what oppression looks like as it starts to wear away.
Talk about that, and you're sitting in the retreat and beginning to use story in the retreat, and I realize that story is part of the origin story of us being here tonight for Storytellers. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Are you good for some questions?
Yeah.
What are you curious about? What would you like to know more about? Yes.
I think right at the end there, Bill, I'm reminded that part of that legal structure now is there needs to be a people to receive the remains. And in so many places, there is no one left. And so there are remains left in cabinets and whatever. So it feels like the people of Pecos is a very special story for that reason.
This was a huge story amongst Native peoples.
So in your story, you're having breakfast and you're reading the newspaper, and then you tell us the story of the article you're reading. It feels like you went and you looked at some history, and you said that it followed you, which I thought was a powerful sentence. One, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, I'm sure he did his own research because it's a beautiful story, and I haven't read the Times in a long time, but I don't know them to go in such detail. Do you know why it has followed you, and why you're so drawn
No, I don't. There's a bit more of the mystery to that. I don't wear the Walatoa T-shirt anymore, but when I tell the story, I do take off my shoes to remind me this is not my path that I'm walked, and that I'm carrying someone else's story. A story workshop, I'd invited once a friend of Jeannie's from when, my wife's, from when she was in Vista working on a Chippewa reservation. And I'd wanted to try telling the story with a native person present, just to make sure that that the telling was respectful. And also just to see what it would be like, because a story is in a way a conversation. In conversation with someone for whom this was kind of more personal connection. And Juanita asked me the next day, said, no, the way you tell the story, it's your story, it doesn't pretend to be my story. But why are you so interested in Native affairs? I told Juanita about the uncovering the bison rib. She said, bison, I had a vision of being with bison once. And I said, oh, well, here's the place where where Jean and I met, where I'd uncovered the bison rib, and I showed her a photo of the place that was on my phone. And her jaw dropped, and she said, that was the place in my vision. So utterly mysterious, but it does, and all I can claim from that is that, in some way, that's how the story, in a way, has followed me or found me. So that's why I kind of welcome the chance to tell it from time to time, because I have just this sense that it's meant for more than me. But there's been so many mysterious aspects to its discovery, I can't know ahead of time who it's meant for. And as the story is unfolded, the story is one of just resonances of things that seem to fit together for a reason I couldn't explain ahead of time, but do seem to really fit together.
I'm sure I'll have loads of questions. I don't just have one, so I'd like to be able to get your contact information so that I can ask you
Sure.
those questions. But I found the story was more of a metaphor for just storytelling in general. Because although so the nice lady here, she made the comment about receiving other people's remains. There's not a lot of people to receive those remains, so the remains just kind of stay there. And then I'm thinking to myself, yeah, but we tell stories so that those remains are received, even though those physical remains are inhabitants, like the stories, the memories, all of those things, the traditions, that's what keeps our culture in terms of being able to share things with each other, to have communities and being of rest. And so I just thought, what a story to tell, in that you get an understanding of what storytelling means to you. And I just think that that's a wonderful, wonderful lesson. I'm so glad to have been part of this audience that you have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Please join me in thanking Carol.